Thank you very much to the Lubbock trustees for inviting me here to have this little talk. I must say ARM is very fortunate to get two cracks at the whip, really, because about halfway through the time I was CEO at ARM, I came and did the Lubbock Lecture in engineering. And the people who were there in the engineering department had to endure a few minutes of discussion about economics and the business model. And so we thought it'd be quite a good idea in this one to include a little bit of background on the technology. I also really must give up, because it's great fun, really having the opportunity to do a little bit of promotion of ARM, but since it's almost 2 years since I was running ARM, then I need to give up doing this sort of thing at some stage in future. So a little bit of background to start with. ARM provides microprocessors, which are like the brains in silicon chips that go into all sorts of electronic products. And so by way of setting the context, we're going to talk just a little bit of microprocessors, then a little bit of ARM and the business, and then a little bit of the semiconductor industry in which ARM operates, and then as we've said, as Peter said, we've got a level playing field for conversation. So microprocessors to start with. There are a lot of myths around microprocessors. Microprocessors are all about the back end of computers, aren't they? It's very boring, lots of wires, grey boxes, and they don't really do anything except excite a bunch of those sort of IT nerds. Well, that is a bit of a myth, because microprocessors are actually at the heart of doing a heck of a lot of really good things in our modern society. So, assisting today with a lot of modern medicine, ensuring that we make excellent use of natural resources that we have. Right now, the amount of power that we generate and the amount of power that we consume in the world, not even mentioning the dreadful things that we do to the environment in terms of creating that power in the first place, it's a fine balance. And so we can actually make our lives much better by using energy ever so much more efficiently. We can make our lives ever so much better by using other natural resources more efficiently, like water, for instance. There's a picture of the size of the planet. The middle-sized blue dot up there is the amount of water on the planet to scale, and the little blue dot is probably actually a bit bigger than it really should be, because that's the amount of water that we have available for our use compared with the size of the planet. And so it is really a fairly scarce resource. Land is another scarce resource as our population is growing, and we run out of space to plant things. Quite a lot of the world's surface is covered in ice or mountain, and quite a lot of the land, rather, on which we could plant things is covered in ice or it's mountains, and you can't get the combine harvesters up there. So it really is a land, an available land for creating food for our growing population is a scarce natural resource like water and power. So the myth that microprocessors is boring and it's all about IT and grey boxes, actually microprocessors are not the panacea that's going to rescue our society, but as we look forward at the beginning of the 21st century, going to be an important part of addressing some big societal challenges. Now I need to back off a little bit from microprocessors and the way in which they're going to, or the sort of big problems they're going to solve, and just a little bit on microprocessors themselves. I think we're all fairly familiar with a simple electronic system. So this is a light with a switch, and you can't really get much simpler in terms of an electronic system than that. This might be, for instance, the one that's outside my back door. When I get home tonight at about midnight, it'll be dark, and I'll be fumbling around for the keyhole. If, on the other hand, I made it just a little bit smarter, then I'd be able to activate it. In this case, I've added a transistor to the electronic system. The transistor works like a switch, replaces the little pull cord switch. And in this particular instance, when light falls on the phototransistor, it turns it on. And if we had it the other way round, so that when that transistor turned on, it disconnected the power from the light, then the converse of that situation would connect the power to the light, and I wouldn't have to fumble around for the key. We could make it even more intelligent and not bother with the light sensors, but make it work off time. We could make it more intelligent and make it recognize what day of the week it is, as well as what time it is, and program the thing to come on and off at different times. This is now getting to be a smarter electronic system, and that thinking, which is represented on the right-hand side of the chart there, is more about what the microprocessor actually does. So a smart electronic system, there isn't really a definition to this. I'd say the thing behaves differently according to different stimuli, and that could be different stimuli provided by the people who are interacting with the system, or natural things like light that are interacting with the system. And as you get more complicated electronic systems, then they can respond to multiple different stimuli and so on, and you can make them even cleverer so that they learn from experiences that they've already had. So a practical definition of a smart electronic system like this is one that uses a microprocessor. It's a microprocessor-based system designed to interact with people or things. That, for me, is a sort of practical definition. I've no idea if that is a real definition. I just wrote it on the slide. However, it illustrates what you use microprocessors for. You use microprocessors to make electronic systems smart, to move from that sort of simple, I'll switch a light on with a switch, to I'll do slightly more clever things with it. Now microprocessors from a slightly more commercial point of view. 1990 was when ARM, the company, was founded. And in those days, the world of microprocessors was all 8 bits. Now, you see microprocessors referred to as 4 bits, 8 bits, 16 bits, 32 bits. This is the number of bits of digital information that the guts of the microprocessor can manipulate at any one time. So yesterday, Samsung introduced their new Galaxy S6 phone. You may have seen it on things like the BBC News and so on. And that has a 64-bit processor in it now. So things have moved on a bit from 8 bits in 1990. A very popular microprocessor is Intel's x86 series, and that became very popular when it became the processor in these PCs. And in 1990, Intel were already gaining market share because PCs had been around for about 5 or 6 years, and Intel were in the process of launching their 8486, their sort of 4th generation of the x86. One characteristic of the microprocessor space at that time was there were loads of businesses, loads of different companies, all promoting their own things. And depending on how you define an individual flavor of microprocessor, or what we call architecture of microprocessor, there were anywhere between 50 and 350 or so. And that was the year that ARM was founded. If I look at the snapshot today, some 24 years later, then there's a rough axis here on the chart of compute capability. So further over towards the right is smarter and more powerful computing. So on the left you have Microchip. Microchip's an 8-bit processor. ARM spans quite a range, and then there are a handful of other architectures that are still left out of the 350. Now, this is a snapshot. There are certainly more than these architectures available today, but in the main, these architectures would account for somewhere in excess of 95% of the world's microprocessors. So the industry is consolidated substantially. And 2 architectures, the x86 and ARM, remain spanning a huge range of different compute power, from relatively simple stuff that you find in your central heating controller up to servers that sit in the cloud and process lots of financial information. Why on earth would you then bother with any of the others? Well, the answer is that you might want to extend the compute power a bit more, but you don't get out for out in this world, as they say. And so if you want to extend the compute power and get to the IBM's power architecture at the top of the slide there, then you have to put more electrical energy into it. So it's as simple as that. And that's really why you end up with different flavors from a technical point of view. It's rather like I have a very powerful diesel engine because I want to put that engine in a Caterpillar tractor or a military tank or something like that. You wouldn't want the miles per gallon that you get out of your military tank to commute regularly between Oxford and London. So you'd want something a bit more efficient, but conversely it wouldn't be quite as powerful an engine. So that's enough about microprocessors, a little bit of an introduction. Snapshot of ARM today. ARM today would call itself a silicon company, a silicon IP company supplying intellectual property to the semiconductor industry. ARM published its results a fortnight or so ago. 12 billion ARM chips were shipped in 2014. ARM is in the business of selling licenses for its microprocessor designs to semiconductor companies, and I'll come on to that. It's a small company on its own. On its own, ARM only employs just over 3,000 people. And the revenue is not massive. It's just over $1 billion of revenue. However, it's a public company, and it's valued fairly highly. It's roughly 15 billion pounds of value today. So this is a very valuable business for the size of business that it is. The way the business model works is you have ARM, the business, and ARM designs microprocessors, does research and development and creates a microprocessor design. It then sells that microprocessor to a partner, a semiconductor company typically, or sometimes to the customer of a semiconductor company. That partner can create multiple designs of chips, including the brain, which is the ARM microprocessor that sits inside. It's a little white square in the black square there is meant to represent the brain that's sat inside. And the partner designs those chips with the license, and that can take 3 or 4 years for the partner to design one of those chips after ARM's already spent 2 or 3 years developing the microprocessor in the first place. And then eventually those chips get sold to real customers who are making computers or TVs or phones or cameras or cars or industrial equipment or lots and lots of things. And those chips will get sold for 20 plus years or so. And this is one of ARM's investor slides, and so that's why it says 20 plus years, because you wouldn't want to put 35 on there and get proved wrong by an investor in 35 years' time. But what I do know is that there are still 8-bit microprocessors out there that ARM is replacing, and those processors were designed in the late 1970s. So these things have a very long life cycle, which means from a business point of view, the revenue which flows, and there's revenue which, the red arrows are revenue arrows, so there's license revenue, that flows for a while ARM is selling licenses, but when those chips are being shipped, there's a per unit royalty which flows. It's a portion of the chip price, and that can flow for many, many years. This is one of the reasons why ARM is a very valuable business today. It's not a unique business model, this sort of investing and then reaping the rewards over many years. It's a bit like a vineyard. The chap who owns a vineyard plants the vines, and then nothing happens for about 4 years. It's a bit similar to designing a chip and then selling the chip to selling the design to a semiconductor company. Nothing happens for 4 years or so, and then the chips start getting sold, and then the royalty starts flowing. And similarly with the vineyard, after about 4 years, they start producing grapes, and you make wine. And from ARM's point of view, the licenses is like planting vines. and the royalty is like the wine that comes off the vines. And there's another similarity to Arm. If the person who owns the vineyard just planted the vines, shoved them in the ground, went away, came back 4 years later, expecting grapes, expecting the grapes to be fantastic grapes that would produce a fine crop of a fine yield of wine, then that person would be disappointed. You actually need to nurture the vines. You need to make sure that the soil's right, you control the bugs, that they don't get too wet, they don't get too cold, they not at the wrong times of year and so on. You have to look after them. You have to nurture the ecosystem which sits around the vine and makes it create wine. And that's what Arm has to do. Having planted a vine by selling a license, it has to nurture the ecosystem around the person who's bought the license. And Arm's ecosystem is huge today, and that's one of the reasons why the architecture is very successful and the business is very valuable. There is an immensely rich network of companies out there that provide complementary technology that works around the Arm microprocessors, so that when somebody is designing and building and selling a product that is built around an Arm microprocessor, they have absolutely unparalleled support in terms of the associated companies in that ecosystem. It is, if you like, the best located vineyard in this business. The business model, as outlined, provides tremendous scale, and this is another reason why the numbers from the valuation point of view are very different from the size of the business itself. There's one Arm, but there's nearly 400 odd semiconductor companies who've active licenses to the product, and so there are tens of thousands of people designing chips. That's system-on-chip engineers, tens of thousands of those, and there's hundreds of thousands of people writing the software for the microprocessors to make them do things and bring the real products to life. And so you really do end up with millions of products that you sell to billions of consumers, and that's why there were 12 billion chips shipped last year. Now, on Arm, just a bit on the semiconductor industry, and then we can get started on the questions. The semiconductor industry is not new, it's not modern. It is actually 70 years old. It is, new by the standards of agriculture, but it's actually, in terms of industrial timelines, it's not a sort of thing that was born yesterday. Over the last 70 years, first transistor around 1947, over the last 70 years, there have been several waves of different technology in the semiconductor industry. We're in the midst of one of those waves now, and every time the technology moves on a bit, it brings typically good things for the consumers at the end. And it's that sort of technological progress which enables the industry and drives the industry to evolve. So things have got much smaller, costs of end products have got a lot cheaper, and that all comes, there's a price to pay for that, of course. It's great for us consumers, and I've got an example in a minute, but it is expensive for the industry. The impact on consumers. Here's a TV from 1974. 1974 is not that long ago, really. It was around when colour TV started to really sort of take off. And that TV would cost you about £250 in 1974. 1974's £250 is about 10x by 2013. So it's about getting on for £2,500. But if you wanted to buy a comparable or the equivalent state-of-the-art television today, by the way, that was a state-of-the-art television in 1974, a state-of-the-art television today, about a centimetre thick or something like that, connects to the internet, does everything for you, then it's basically half the price, less than half the price, and it does ever so much more for you. So consumers have really benefited. But the industry has had to relentlessly invest over the years, and not just invest in a linear fashion, but invest in a steadily growing fashion. So this has become a more and more expensive industry in which to operate. The cost of delivering all that benefit to the consumer has to be borne somewhere. It's also a very volatile industry. This is a picture of the last several years. Obviously, around 2007, there was the sort of starting noise of the last global downturn. In 2008, we got it pretty badly, and that rattled through to the semiconductor industry quite quickly. But look at the difference between bookings is orders coming in, by the way, and billings is revenue and chip sales. And we're talking a factor of 6 on a sort of monthly bookings, or sorry, 3-month rolling average here. So you've got to invest these huge sums of money in capital expenditure, but you've got a very, very volatile top line, and if you've got a lot of money depreciating, that's effectively a fixed cost for you, and so it's not a place for the faint-hearted at all. And yet there are people out there who continue to do it. And so companies like Intel will regularly, and Samsung, there they are, regularly investing tens of billions of dollars per annum every year in this industry, in spite of the volatile background. So there's obviously some money to be made somehow. So why on earth would they put themselves through that torture in terms of running their business? Well, the answer is they don't want the other guys to win. The semiconductor industry started just before 1954, but this picture is a local picture from Oxford of Roger Bannister, and he's busy breaking the 4-minute mile, the barrier that was to run a mile in less than 4 minutes. Now, I heard an anecdote last year when there was a lot of sort of reminders about this anniversary, and one of the anecdotes was, I have no idea how true it was, but that shortly before they went and did this, they went down the pub at lunchtime to have a meal. Now, can you imagine in 2012 at the Olympics, this guy nipping down the pub just before he got his gold medal? It doesn't happen. Over that time that the semiconductor industry has been there, generally things have become a lot more competitive. People tend to, in this case, in the British cycling team, it was all about marginal differences, and it's all about attention to detail and rigorous execution. And that's really why the semiconductor guys continue to invest. It's all about being horrendously competitive. So I mentioned the capital expenditure and how this sort of really makes a huge structural cost, or a huge fixed cost that's there all the time. How can people help address this? And this is my last little bit of introduction. This is how ARM's business model helps the semiconductor industry. So you've got a typical enterprise. They get buying some goods in, they're adding some value, they're selling stuff out at the other end. And in an ideal world, what they manage to command a selling price that is higher than the cost of the value in plus the value add, and therefore they make a profit. When they look at how they can improve on that, they can look at the cost of the value add, some of which is fixed, and they can say, yeah, some of it is really differentiating, and it's contributing, therefore, to our profit, and some of it is just a cost of being in this business. And everybody else is doing exactly the same thing. I wonder if we can do that a bit smarter. And so that's where you get the outsourcing bit coming from. They look at the undifferentiated cost, and they outsource it because they find a bunch of people in some other part of the world, typically, where they can exploit the labor a little bit more than they do in more developed economies. And that undifferentiated cost gets reduced by a small amount, and so you can make a bit more profit. And that's sort of outsourcing. There are smarter ways of doing it. Instead of just simply outsourcing it, why don't we buy it from a company that really specializes in doing this in a in a seriously different way, not just at 90% of the cost, but at a fraction of the cost. And that's what an IP company does. So instead of having the slice that is almost as big as the whole undifferentiated slice, the IP company is only going to charge the yellow bit. In other words, it's a significant reduction in the cost. And that means that there's some available, lots more available to make more profit, or if you want to make a bit less profit, you can invest some of it into additional differentiation, make your products more competitive, and make even more money. So that's what happens with an IP company like ARM. ARM designs the microprocessor, costs roughly the same as it does for the semiconductor company to design the microprocessor and maintain that big ecosystem that we talked about, which would cost a semiconductor company a lot of money. And charitably, ARM provides that microprocessor design and the ecosystem to the semiconductor companies at a fraction of what it would cost them to do. And of course, that doesn't really work for a company like ARM unless they can do that multiple times, and that is exactly what they do. So they sell it the same thing multiple times around the industry. It's good for the IP company because they end up making a profit, because if you add up all the little yellow slices, it comes to bigger than the original undifferentiated slice by some substantial margin. And the semiconductor companies themselves have, rather than just all wasted the money doing the same thing, they've got what they would otherwise do much more cheaply. And that sounds like alchemy, but it isn't really. This man spotted it quite a long time ago. So this is Adam Smith, and he's on the £20 notes at the moment, and he observed this specialization, which is effectively what's happening, and he chose the example of a pin factory. And that was a couple of hundred years or so ago when Adam Smith did that, and he thought he was very clever spotting it. Actually, it's been around for years and years and years. You know, we all did a little bit of everything once upon a time, and then some people specialized in being explorers and going hunting, and then some people specialized in the actual sort of listening to where the explorers had found the animals and went and killed them, and that meant that some people could sit back in the cave and talk. And you know, that's essentially society benefiting from this sharing of tasks and specializing. So Adam Smith wasn't really that original. And of course, this is, I always say that this is kind of evolved, and you know, you've got the marketing people and the sales people and the management sat back in the cave. But it's widely used in the semiconductor industry, and it isn't just in microprocessor design. In the semiconductor industry today, over the last several years, we can see that things have moved, and this specialization applies to design tools, design automation tools. It applies to lots of different pieces of semiconductor IP, not just microprocessors. It applies to manufacture, because the capital equipment to do all that manufacture is also very expensive, and it applies to the design and creation of the equipment that goes into those factories. So individual companies can effectively they're collaborating to create this economic value together. And if you look at the numbers, then just briefly, if you just look at what ARM's done, then there's probably about a factor of 8 of cost saving that would otherwise have been spent by the semiconductor industry, if you compare how much they've spent with ARM. Those numbers are a bit sort of crude in the back of the envelope. It might be half a dozen times, it might be 10 times, I can't actually say. But it's a pretty big impact. And that's the sort of impact that ARM has. So with that, I think we've talked about microprocessors, we've talked about ARM and the business model, we've talked about the semiconductor industry. I think we can start with some Q&A.
Okay, great. So I think I'm going to start, if that's okay. So Warren, you've explained how, going back to 1990, 350 microprocessor designs, large number of companies. At the end, we know that ARM thrived. I remember reading something about what fraction of the microprocessors and devices you supply. Maybe you could remind that number. Why did ARM succeed? Back to 1990, a lot of different firms could have succeeded in this space. What was it about ARM? Luck? A better design? I don't know.
Yeah.
The weather?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors actually, and this is why ARM continues to represent an interesting sort of business case, because there isn't a magic bullet answer to that question. The technology was fundamentally a little bit better than some others in some respects. The chart that I put up there showed that ARM processors are relatively efficient, and certainly the original ARM processors were very relatively efficient, so power efficient. So it gave an advantage in some cases in terms of power. The business model itself, of course, was quite good timing. You saw the chart from 1970s through to now, and it wasn't just in microprocessors, this sort of propensity to want to share cost and use that sort of Adam Smith specialization piece in the industry. The industry was ready for it, so timing was probably quite crucial. And then I think also there's, and I would say this, wouldn't I? I think there's a lot in the culture of the business. You can have a fantastic strategy, you can have some fantastic technology, a fantastic market opportunity, and it's still possible to screw it up. And typically, it gets screwed up because business actually happens between people. And people, if people behave in the wrong way, then business won't happen. And in a business-to-business environment, where decision-making tends to be a bit more rational than in business-to-consumer, where you can do some clever marketing things and perhaps sort of slightly make people make irrational purchase decisions. That happens less in a business-to-business environment, and so it's really important that people behave appropriately. So technology, timing, and culture, but I also think luck. A huge amount of luck. When ARM started, ARM was a spin-out from a pre-existing company. The technology was there. And I'm often asked the question, well, what would have happened if you'd been in Silicon Valley? If ARM had been in Silicon Valley, quite simply, it would not exist today. Instead of having a bunch of people with virtually no funding whatsoever, there would have been funding. They would have pissed all the funding away on expensive marketing. It just wouldn't exist. So one of the elements of luck, for instance, was the lack of funding. I would maintain.
May we all be lucky. Can I go back to, you said it was luck, it was timing, and culture was in there. And there's this great quote about how culture eats strategy every day for breakfast. You were CEO. CEOs can't determine culture, but you can affect culture. So what, as CEO, did you do to create or support or nudge this culture to lead to that success?
Well, I think the words that you used there about supporting and nudging are pretty much what the CEO can do. I think it's important for the leader of a business to lead by example. And so, for instance, if you're preaching, and one of the things that I would preach, for instance, is responsiveness, pace, respect, teamwork, all these things that you read in management textbooks, and you might have some slightly different words for them in some management textbooks, but it's all that sort of thing. It's important that the leader does that, leads by example. It's then important that the leadership team around the leader leads by example, and that there is a lot of communication. If you've got a business like ARM and like many, many businesses today with employees all over the world from lots of different backgrounds, they don't all think like Western, like North Americans, basically. And so it's very important that communication happens between that leadership team and the people throughout the organization. And communication is two-way. It isn't a bunch of leaders rock up to some remote office and give a quick presentation and they're out. It's actually interacting with people that is important. And I think if you do that over multiple years and you patiently sit at it, then you can actually achieve sort of results and establish a culture that works. And to an extent, you also have to allow for the culture to evolve. You can't be completely rigid. One of the benefits of hiring, more people and hiring slightly different shaped people and so on is that you benefit from their different views, their different skills, their different approaches to life and so on. And you have to allow the culture to evolve to take advantage of some of those things. But hanging on to sort of some fundamental tenets like, we're going to be responsive, we're going to be nice, relatively nice to people, we are in the business of making money, we are going to make decisions, we're not going to talk about things until they're, until we've achieved a fantastic decision, but the world has moved on, and unfortunately the decision's invalid. So all of those types of things you build in.
Were there any points where you saw the culture headed in the wrong direction and you had to intervene to try to nudge it back?
Yeah, I think one of the, in a company like ARM, which has enjoyed success, and ARM has enjoyed continued success over multiple years, then arrogance, complacency are serious threats. And part of the regular communication that I talked about would be making sure that people understood that complacency is a threat. Arrogance is not to be tolerated and is also a threat to business. When times are tough, then people do tend to get a bit disillusioned, think it's all over. That was fantastic, but now, for instance, in 2009, ARM's revenue dropped by approximately 50% when that downturn happened that I showed on the chart. And so some people began to believe quite quickly that there's no recovery from this. It's not happening. The magic is gone. The formula is gone. So there you have the opposite of complacency and arrogance. You get a little bit of desperation, and there it's important to rein people back and think about actually this is an industry which does suffer from volatility. There are very good reasons for why the revenue's gone like that, and there are very good reasons why it's actually going to recover and get back on track. I don't think there's any substitution for just regular, sensible communication.
Okay. Let me try a couple more, and then I'll open it up, just maybe one more, and then up to... So we have a new report out that we released at Davos about CEOs and the role of CEOs and the hardest things that CEOs have to do in this day and age. And one of the surprising conclusions is that of the 152 CEOs that we interviewed, many of them talked about, although not in public, in private, about the power of doubt. The fact that they had to make big decisions, and after they made those decisions, they were confident in them and they moved forward. But there were periods of severe doubt. As a CEO, what was a situation where you found yourself making an extraordinarily hard decision and you might have doubted, at least before you made the decision? We also say that doubt to a CEO is like nerves to an elite athlete, that it actually can enhance your performance. So any situations where you had to make a big, I don't want to say bet the firm type decision, but a big material decision that you face substantial doubt, how did you deal with it? How did you kind of work through to a solution?
I can think of two situations. The first one was just after I became CEO. ARM produced its only, so far, serious profit warning. And that was fairly serious profit warning. I joked earlier about the share price and the multiple of 3. Well, you know, if you took the timing around about the profit warning, then it was like a factor of 20 or 30 or something like that, because the share price moved from £1.20 to 38 pence in the morning, and it was pretty grim. But it was also pretty obvious to me that, and I was just as responsible as others because I'd been part of the management team, even though I'd only just become CEO. We basically sort of bled the thing a bit dry and didn't have anything in the cupboard for people to buy. And we had too much cost in the organisation going forwards, and we needed to reduce some cost. Well, in an organisation like ARM, there is no capital to speak of, it's people. So there wasn't really a doubt about we need to remove some people. The difficult decision was, how many people do we need to remove? How much are we going to remove from the cost base, knowing that this was going to be quite a shock to the organisation, which had hitherto known nothing but, you know, up and to the right, and many of them didn't really have a clue about, you know, why. So that was the first sort of experience of, and so it wasn't a binary doubt, it was a sort of, every answer I look at here is wrong. So which is the least wrong? But at the back of my mind, of course, I knew the fundamental principle was absolutely right. And the second one was when we did an acquisition, which was the first seriously large acquisition that we'd done, which was about, in market cap terms, it was roughly 40% of the size of ARM. And it was buying an American company, and we were a British company, and of course British companies can't buy American companies. That's received wisdom, and so on. And so there was, it would have been much easier not to do that. Much easier not to do it at all. We could have carried on, the investors would have been happy, the staff wouldn't have seen the investors get very disappointed with the management. There wouldn't have been a sort of almost a vote of no confidence in the management. But strategically, we had to do that acquisition because of certain evolutions of technology happening, and we could see a situation that in 5 or 6 years' time was going to manifest itself in ARM being seriously less competitive. So we went ahead. And I did doubt it because, and I actually doubted it more after we did it for a while, when the reality, and I'd been told, you know, the investors are not going to like this. Are you sure you really want to do this? But the reality was that we had to do it. And then when the wrath of the investors descended upon us, and when the doubts from the staff were witnessing all this and witnessing the damage to the share price and so on, and then when we got into the acquisition and realised quite what a complete mess it was that we'd bought, then I did doubt for 6 to 9 months. But I think, as you say, you know, doubt is it keeps you going.
And
it's internal debate.
One follow-up, and then we'll go to the question. So when you were trying to make that decision, and clearly neither one of these was easy decisions, and one of the things we're trying to understand is how is it that people make decisions, these really hard decisions? Did you go outside the firm for advice? Did you get your senior team together? Did you contemplate things that happen in other industries? How did you, other than saying, okay, it's done, today's the decision point, how is it that you got comfortable with those decisions? You know, MBAs think that you can pull out a spreadsheet, you know, you can run a few numbers. It's all very simple.
Well, you can make the numbers say whatever you want them to say, really. So I don't think the numbers were hugely helpful. No, I think it was understanding the strategic imperative, and I mentioned in when answering the question about culture that, you know, I am a believer in teamwork and 2 heads are better than 1. I'm also a believer in, for the CEO, that leadership team needs to be really, really capable. I would have been perfectly happy to report to at least half of the executive team that worked for me at ARM, and that half were pretty much chosen for that reason, to have the best players on the team. I had a little cartoon produced. Somebody produced a cartoon once that had a picture of a tall person and a short person. I'm obviously quite a short person. So I thought it was fun to put on my wall so that people could see it when they came into the office. And it said, if we continually hire people who are smaller than us, we will become a small company. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And so teamwork is really important. So it wasn't me getting comfortable with that strategic rationale. It was us getting comfortable with that strategic rationale. But as the leader, of course, you know when you go home at night and everybody else is gone, that you know that it's actually your fault.
Okay. Let's open it up to the audience.
Thanks, Peter. Fascinating insight. I just want to take you back to 1990 and just look at that, the other big beast in the jungle at that time, because Intel is everywhere, I guess.
Yeah.
Where did that feature in your formative stages as a threat or whatever? And could you shed some light on your relationship in that marketplace since 1990, given the way that Intel is a competitor?
Yeah. Well, for the first sort of 6 years, so up until about the mid-90s, 5 to 6 years, Intel was there. Intel may eat us one day, but we got business to run. We just got to get on with it, and we'll sort of get whatever we can get and try and establish as strong a position as we can. And if Intel comes one day, then we'll deal with that problem out in the future. Then, in about the mid-1990s, I certainly started to believe that this could work, and therefore, who was going to be worried by this? And so Intel was sort of there on the charts, and I had a formative meeting with Nokia, which turned out to be one of ARM's bigger customers, and in the sort of early prototypes for their smartphones that they were working on at that time, they had an Intel microprocessor. And all we did was say, that's stupid, we've got a perfectly good one here. You don't have to switch suppliers. You can use the ARM business model. Because for a customer like Nokia, then one of the benefits of the ARM business model is they can buy the chips from as many different licensees as they want, and they won't be held to ransom by a single company and so on. So we played that economic benefit for the customer into them. And that was the first little sort of skirmish with Intel, really. Then a couple of years later, but Intel still wasn't the main threat in those days. It was kind of out there, but they were in PCs, and we made a conscious decision, and this is where I certainly didn't need any team to help me make a conscious decision on this one, that there was absolutely no point in going after the PC business whatsoever. It would cost a fortune. Intel would eat us for breakfast, and it would just be one way of grinding the company into the dirt sooner rather than later. One day, maybe, when we're bigger, we'll be able to go into PCs. Anyway, Intel bought one of ARM's licensees in 1998, something like that, or 99, and it must have been 99 because we had a share price, and when Intel bought the ARM licensee, the share price went up, and everybody said, oh, Intel's now an ARM licensee, so that's wonderful. So then for a little while, it was nice having the enemy inside the tent. Then in about 2004, they got wise and decided to go their own way, and I had a meeting and a phone call and was told that they'd still be shipping ARM stuff for years, but at that stage we knew it was kind of war. And then I think in 2007 the journalists started noticing, and I said, and then they said, oh, aren't you very worried? And well, actually, Actually, yes, but to the journalist, the answer was, well, of course not. I mean, who's to say that Intel are going to win just because they're Intel? And that was a sort of tonal message. Then it's any sort of competition. Intel has some fantastic technology, fantastic market position, brilliant people, loads of money. ARM has a very attractive business model. Effectively, it's sort of a guerrilla war versus a big army. And competition exists.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know how to sort of go
Yours
where
now,
next, but
so.
okay.
Just one question. Obviously, I'm slightly interested in the company at King's Langley, but yourselves and ARM and IMG have one thing when I go to King's Langley is the dedication of the staff and the culture of the business. These are absolutely unique businesses. Probably outside agriculture, you wouldn't find that dedication. I noticed several other companies in Cambridge have been taken over by American companies. Do you think either of those companies could survive if they just got gobbled up by American corporations? Because it's staff, isn't it? That's what drives them. A handful of people who are very, very clever.
Yeah, I think it would be quite challenging, but it would depend on the company. Having experienced it the other way round and sort of taken on one sort of relatively big chunk of people, we actually found it quite difficult, and they really didn't fit very well. And those that didn't adapt basically left after a while, and it would depend completely on the business. I think it would be tough for an American company. Often been asked, well, why don't you just move the headquarters to Silicon Valley? It's where the center of the industry is, blah, blah, blah. Actually, there's something that helped. It isn't just not having the funding. There's something about being a UK-based business in this semiconductor world that is advantageous. Yes, you do get access to quite good quality of engineers. Well, you could get that if you're an American company and you just had a design center in Europe. But I think the Brits are quite good at sort of blending cultures and evolving cultures and taking on and accepting other cultures. It's like the English language. It evolves in the same way by sort of absorbing and using. And I'm not sure, certainly thinking about the sort of getting on for 1,000 people that ARM has in the US, they don't all fit. Some of them do, of course. There's nearly 1,000 of them that fit perfectly well, but they don't all fit naturally, and I think it would be an issue.
Just following on, should that be a matter of government to be worried about? Some of these absolute flagship companies falling prey to, I think of autonomy actually as a good example.
Yes.
But these are the core of our future economic growth, ARM,
Mm-hmm.
MG. Do you have any thoughts on that, whether the government should in any way intervene?
Well, I did worry a little bit, and we had quite a lot of sort of takeover speculation and stuff in and around ARM over the years, and it comes in waves. And you say in answer to the questions, well, we're a public company. If somebody's prepared to pay enough money, then there's not much we can do. Would I, at that stage, in that situation, be on the phone to business innovation and skills and say, come on? Of course I would in that situation, but actually you can't rely on it, and so I worked much harder on messaging about the business model itself being a defence rather than needing to run to the government as a defence. And the business model that I outlined on the slides there is actually quite robust in terms of providing a defence, because if somebody wants to buy ARM today, I think I'll put 15 billion quid on the slide. It's about 16.5 today because Mobile World Congress is on, so there's a bit of froth in the share price. But £16 billion plus a premium. You're talking north of $30 billion. There aren't that many semiconductor companies in the world that, are sort of that type of valuation. There are some big companies like Apple, for instance, for whom 30 billion is not quite lunch money, but it's a posh meal out. So it is possible, but why on earth would they want to spend $30 billion when they can license the thing for a tiny fraction of that cost? Well, the only answer would be to stop their competitors getting it. But if you look at the licenses that ARM's already sold, then their competitors have got those licenses. If you look at the timelines for designs, then the timeline I put on the slide there was 2 or 3 years of design, another 4 years of chip design. It's a kind of 7-year period. And although there are a reduced number of microprocessor architectures out there today, there's nothing stopping anybody in 7 years coming up with an alternative. So it doesn't really make sense for... And so if somebody like Apple were to make a rational decision, they would quite quickly get to that rational decision that it doesn't make sense. Others? Look. Yeah, okay.
So actually, so I'm an MBA here. My previous employer was Intel. Before coming here.
You sure you're not a spy?
There's no allegiances or anything like that. Saïd, man. So there's a story within Intel that supposedly around 2006, Steve Jobs had gone to Paolo Codolini, the CEO at that time, and said, "Listen, this is the prototypes we have for the iPhone. We would like to have an Intel chip inside." And there was a discussion at the Intel boardroom that had basically culminated in a decision of saying, thanks, but no thanks. Mobile chips is a low-margin industry. We're not really interested in that. I was just curious, knowing a lot of the players, is that rumor you think true? Do you think that's what happened?
I think it's possibly there's an element of hindsight in there. I don't think it's true, but I was very worried. The Apple design was obviously a flagship design, and it was no secret that Intel, from a perspective, enough people at Intel were pretty desperate to win that design. So we went through a period of considerable concern at ARM that would happen. I think if you look at the players, however, and you look at the psyche behind Apple, then Apple love control. I know Intel love control, but Apple are kind of PhDs to Intel's A-level on this. The ARM business model allows Apple to control their chip design, which Intel were not prepared to do. There's no way that Intel could, they would destroy their business if they flipped into licensing, allowing freedom around the x86 architecture and so on and so on. So I think, but this is hindsight from me as well, by the way. I was very worried at the time, but I can see that it wouldn't really fit.
I just wanted to say I really liked your bit about the dangers of complacency and arrogance, because I remember being at Intel at that time. I was hired in 2009. It was a good 2 or 3 years where there was a sort of mild ignorance where people just said, I think Paul Otolini once called the iPad executive jewelry at a talk at the factory I worked at, and so I think they're now regretting their decisions. Particularly good.
Yeah, I think they are, but at the end of the day, don't forget, Intel is still churning out 60% margins and $50+ billion of revenue per annum, and they're learning to live with ARM. And I think that it's, if you go right back to the start of what microprocessors can do in terms of helping us address issues like energy and scarce natural resources and all these sort of things, and Intel is now getting well beyond the PC. I think there's plenty of room in this market for Intel to continue to thrive, in spite of my inbuilt bias that ARM is going to be everywhere. I think another question on that would be, if Intel really wants to play in some of the spaces that where the ecosystem is developed around the ARM architecture, why don't they just buy a license? I mean, they were licensees once upon a time. Why don't they just accept it and move on?
Maybe I'll know in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. Well, there we are. Hello.
Hi. It's interesting to talk about control. I was
Yes.
wondering what is your view of open source electronics and ARM's position on that? Things like Raspberry Pi.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the ARM model, it is pretty close to open source. And so ARM is inherently favorably disposed towards open source. Yes, ARM makes a little bit of money in the process, so it isn't true. Well, actually, it is true open source. It's just not free. If you look at open source and the history behind open source, it means open, as in access, open access. It doesn't necessarily mean free, and you've got a lot of very successful companies that have evolved businesses around providing services around free open source software. I mean, intrinsically, you don't get something for nothing in this world. And so open source, yes. Free, not sure that is really that sustainable. And if you look at, the really successful bits of free open source software, then they're not free. There is, if you want to actually use them, then you fork out for the support.
So I was wondering if you could maybe take a look forward. China is supposed to spend $170 billion in building out a semiconductor industry that is finding Qualcomm $954 billion, supposedly antitrust violations. Do you have an opinion on sort of how that might affect a company like ARM, and sort of where you see China moving in terms of the electronics industry, and whether that will change the playing field?
Yeah, and it might. One of the things I didn't really put in the introduction, because we'd be here all night if I had, is any sort of numerical data around things like royalty rates. So ARM's typical royalty is between 1% and 2% of the chip price. And that's not really a big... If you're a Chinese phone manufacturer, then the fact that your chip supplier has paid 1 or 2% of the chip price in ARM royalty is not really going to keep you awake at night. It might, from a point of principle, keep the Chinese government awake at night because there's an ARM microprocessor in there rather than a Chinese-designed microprocessor. But again, if you back off for a bit and say, well, I can use this analogy, the brain. The microprocessor is the brain. Well, you've got a brain, and he's got a brain, and I've got a brain. And actually, if you look at our brains, they're all pretty similar, and I would defy you, if you had them there on the table, to spot yours from his from mine. However, you think in a different... You're you, and here's him, and I am me. And we all think differently, we behave differently, and we do different things. That's because we are different people built around this, essentially the same brain. And the thoughts that we have running through that brain are very different. Your thoughts and my thoughts. And that's like the software that runs on the microprocessor. They're the thoughts. And so the sell to the Chinese government that might be a little bit paranoid about it is, well, it is the same brain, but look at the economic benefits you get from having that brain and designing products that can just plug into the ecosystem that's already there. And the chip itself and the phone are still designed by Chinese companies. And a MediaTek chip is very different from a Spreadtrum chip. And once you get to the phone level, then they can be even more different because there's much more scope for product differentiation and unique Chineseness. Anyway, that's the sell. And against that, the 1.5% of chip price versus the economic benefits of going with a standard which make it much easier for Chinese companies to sell both their chips and their products into a global market, is an overwhelming economic argument. And I know that there might be these ideological arguments coming out of China, but in my experience, most of the Chinese are pretty sound economically and as business people.
I was wondering if you ever had any issues with IP security and IP licensing, sharing, or solid design, or even fear that happening if the Chinese manufacturers?
Well, again, I mean, yes, one is obviously concerned, but you come down to the economics of it. If I'm, so let's suppose I'm a disreputable chip manufacturer and I'm not going to bother paying an ARM license. I'm just going to sort of ship ARMs out to some customers. And let's suppose I've got a customer who's building a computer or a phone or something like that. I'm selling a chip that's about $20 into somebody who's going to sell a phone for about $100. The $100 phone man can buy the chip from me, because I'm unscrupulous, at about 20 cents less than he can buy the phone from somebody who's got a absolutely a certain ARM. My ARM, there's always going to be a little doubt about it. I've got some very good engineers and they produce absolutely perfect copy. But it's a microprocessor. And when that phone leaves the factory, it doesn't know what software is going to run on it. It doesn't know what apps you're going to download. It doesn't know the origin of those apps. And so there is a chance that very small chance, but there is a chance that that copy might not work in exactly the same way as the real thing. And that $100 phone has a difference of 20 cents for that insurance that it's going to be the real thing. And that $100 phone really wants to be sold all around the world where, in some countries they have a slightly different approach to IP than others and so on. So that's the kind of inbuilt assurance, if you like. Is there leakage? Yes, there is definitely leakage. ARM, like many software companies with royalty models, employs accountants to do audits and that sort of thing to make sure that the numbers add up. Does ARM have problems, disputes, and that sort of thing? Yes, of course. Is it massive? No, it's just part of doing business. Are there other things other than the chips that people rip off, like some of the software tools and so on? Yes, when there were contraband ARM software tools being sold in places like China, I said, "Oh, great, we don't need to spend on marketing; it's doing it itself." You have to take a practical approach.
Warren, speaking of a practical approach, maybe you can take one or two more questions, and then we can go outside.
Yep.
Have some wine, and you can continue to ask questions to Warren out there. But you can take a few more if you'd like.
Okay, let's couple more. Hello.
Yeah, ARM's focused a lot on consumer market. I was wondering what is ARM's strategy on the Intel things for the industry, industrial Intel?
Yeah. Because of the ARM business model where ARM is making, a 1 to 2% of the chip price, then clearly ARM wants to be in markets that are high volume typically, because the sort of chip that might be a microprocessor in a piece of industrial equipment might well be a similar sort of performance and not really more than, say, 3x the price of the chip that's in a TV. And so you'd want to be in the TV because the volume is significantly different. Would you want to be in the industrial products eventually? Absolutely. This is back to the Intel question about coexistence. If you're building relatively low volumes of kit, stuff that's sat in a factory on a production line, then it might be easier just to take a PC and strip the box off and stick the PC in there. But that still needs to communicate and connect and if you take your average PC today, there's one Intel microprocessor and 3 or 4 ARM chips scattered around doing the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth and the hard disk drive and all of those other sorts of things, and the same in the industrial environment, and that's an example of coexistence. But the Internet of Things more broadly, ARM obviously sees that as a huge opportunity, and certainly in the couple of years since I've left, then that strategy is evolving nicely. One here? I'll go side to side.
So what was the primary purpose of starting this company? Especially at the time of 1990, when the environmental issues has already come up. Is it to compete with other nations, or to improve the technology, or solely to make some money? And may I ask another question?
Well, let's have. I hope I can remember the first one while you're answering the second. But go on. You answer the second. And
the second one is simple. Just why was it named ARM?
Okay. So both questions are actually tightly related. I have to say, nothing as fancy as lots of decisions about balance of political power. It was necessity. ARM spun out of a UK computer company called Acorn. Acorn was not doing very well and losing money, and had an in-house microprocessor design team, and they wanted that cost off the P&L. And so they were very keen to ship that off the P&L. But their computers were dependent on this ARM microprocessor. So somehow, rather than just firing the team, they needed to keep the team alive so that the team would continue to design ARM microprocessors for their computer. And so it was spun out. On the other side of the pond, Apple was also, having been quite successful, was not so successful. But Apple wanted to have a low-power microprocessor for some handheld products that they were thinking of developing. And they identified the Acorn one, well, with a bit of help, they identified the Acorn one as being a likely candidate. And so Apple did invest some money, I think it was about $1 million, into this spin-out. So it was complete luck and driven by the necessity of getting the cost off the P&L. And why was it called ARM? Well, it's the type of microprocessor that ARM is it's a RISC microprocessor. And in microprocessor parlance, that stands for reduced instruction set computing. So rather than have a huge vocabulary or instruction set, it has a limited vocabulary, which makes for a smaller microprocessor and a more power efficient microprocessor. And actually, once you get enough words, then if you speak with somebody who has a vocabulary of 2,000 words and speak with somebody who has a vocabulary of 8,000 words, you'd barely tell the difference. The person with the 2,000 word vocabulary would repeat words a bit more often. And that's what happens with reduced instruction set computing. And so the R stands for RISC, and the M stands for microprocessor, and the A stands for Acorn. So it was Acorn RISC microprocessor. And then when it became ARM, obviously it couldn't be Acorn anymore, so then it stood for Advanced RISC Machines. And then when it became a public company, the financial community weren't too hot on the word risk. And so we dropped the risk and it just became ARM. Okay? Yeah, I think you had the last one.
Can you talk a little bit about what obstacles would be needed to be overcome if Moore's law keeps hold?
Well, I could talk sort of all evening on that. Moore's law is where it's not really a law, it's an observation that the semiconductor technology improves to the extent that the transistor feature sizes get smaller, so you can fit more transistors on a single chip. And Moore observed that over a period of 18 months to 2 years, the number of transistors in the same size piece of silicon roughly doubles. You do that by making the feature sizes of the transistors smaller. And the small size is, or the size of features is controlled by how small you can make the features on a mask that you put over the top of the silicon when you expose the silicon to gases that change the nature of the silicon underneath. Where the mask is covering the silicon, you don't get the change. Where the mask isn't covering the silicon, you do get the change because the gases get diffused into the silicon. The size at which you can make those masks, if you imagine drawing with a finer and finer and finer pencil, eventually you wouldn't be able to see it. But if you had very, very good eyes, you might be able to see much smaller wavelengths of light, and you would be able to see, therefore, smaller and smaller feature sizes. So it's kind of limited by the wavelength of the light that we're able to produce when making the masks. Today, state of the art, I referred to the Samsung Galaxy phone launched yesterday. So state of the art in that sort of volume production is feature sizes of 14 nanometers. The semiconductor industry works with a roadmap that says, well, we can probably go beyond 14, we can get to 10, we can get to 7, we can probably get to about 4. And once you get to about 4, then they don't really know whether they can be made very reliably or not. If you have, I won't go into detail. You don't know whether you can make them much more reliably than that. Do I believe that's the end of the semiconductor industry? Not at all. I pointed out that the wave of the industry that we're in at the moment, which is called bulk CMOS, bulk complementary metal oxide semiconductors, is the latest in a series of waves that the industry has gone through over the last 70 years. And I do believe that given that this barrier through just shrinking this stuff will eventually be a real barrier, we'll be down to individual atoms and the like, then the industry will come up with another solution. One possible idea at the moment is changing the actual materials. So silicon can go so far and delivers a certain amount of compute performance for a certain amount of electrical power. If you change the material, then you can get a bit better. So rather than just making it smaller, we can sort of, if you like, add spices to make it better. What the answer will be, I can't tell you what the answer will be right now, but I do know that the industry has developed a resilience over multiple decades to the end of each individual wave. I think that's probably quite a good sort of
Great place
point
to stop, Warren. Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
This is the challenge to all of you. Figure out the answer to that question in your generation.
That would be a good one.
I'm afraid you're going to have to find some engineers to work with, though. So for those of you who are business school students, part of our job is to reach out across the university to our engineering friends. We've been particularly delighted to have Warren here today, and I hope all of you can join us outside for a drink and ask him even more questions. Thank you
Please
so
do.
much, Warren, for your insight. Thank you.
Thank you.